He didn't arrive in a shiny car with tinted windows. There was no proud parent adjusting his tie or waving from the driver's seat of an SUV. He came on foot, walking down the sidewalk with a backpack that had clearly been used for years, the seams faded, the straps stretched thin. His shoes were clean, but worn down in a way that told stories of being repaired more than once. At the gates of St Andrew's Academy, a private school that looked more like a small college campus, he slowed his steps. The building rose in front of him with tall windows and brick walls that seemed to glow in the morning light. The place felt like it belonged in a brochure, the kind that promised opportunity, prestige, and futures paved in gold. He knew most of the students here came from families who could afford to pay the steep tuition without blinking. He also knew that if it weren't for a scholarship, he would never have stepped foot past these gates. Parents were still dropping off their kids. Sleek cars lined up in front of the entrance. A girl stepped out of a black sedan, holding a designer tote, her mother smoothing her blazer before she disappeared inside. A boy in a crisp uniform hopped out of a silver car, earbuds in, scrolling through his phone like he had the whole world in his pocket. When the boy with the worn backpack walked past, conversations softened. A few parents whispered, eyes following him. One leaned toward another and murmured, "That must be the scholarship kid." The words weren't meant to be cruel, but they hung in the air like a label, one that stuck before he had the chance to introduce himself. He kept his gaze down, gripping the strap of his backpack tighter. It wasn't the first time he'd been noticed for the wrong reasons. He grew up in a neighbourhood where hard work meant keeping the lights on, not affording piano lessons or summer camps. His father fixed cars at a small garage. His mother worked double shifts at a diner. They were proud, but pride didn't pay tuition at a school like this, only a scholarship did. Inside the lobby, students gathered in groups, laughing and catching up like they'd known each other for years. Some compared schedules, others compared sneakers. He stood at the edge, not sure where to go, clutching a folded piece of paper with his class assignments. One boy glanced at him, then back at his friends, smirking. Another nudged his buddy and said under his breath, "Guess charity cases come with free lunch too." They laughed softly, not enough for a teacher to hear, but enough for him to catch every word. He took a slow breath. This was the price of being different here. The scholarship had opened the door, but it had also painted a target on his back. He reminded himself why he was here, because his grades had been perfect, because he'd studied late nights under a dim lamp, because someone on the admissions board had believed he deserved a chance. Still, believing it was one thing, proving it, that was another. As the morning bell rang and the groups shuffled toward their classrooms, he followed, blending into the flow. Yet even as he moved with the crowd, he felt apart from it. His jacket was older, his notebook second-hand, his future uncertain. And though no one else knew it yet, the boy with the worn backpack carried something that no uniform, no car, and no whispered judgment could measure. Something that, in time, would silence every laugh in this school. The whispers that started at the front gate didn't stop in the hallways. They followed Daniel into the cafeteria, riding on every sideways glance, every quiet laugh. By noon, the smell of pizza and fries drifted down the corridor, pulling students toward the double doors that led to the heart of campus life. The cafeteria was a sea of noise, lockers slamming shut, sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, voices bouncing off the high ceiling. Daniel joined the lunch line, gripping his tray. Around him, kids ordered pepperoni slices, chicken sandwiches, bottles of soda. Some scanned their student IDs without thinking twice, while others tossed cash casually onto the counter. When it was his turn, he shook his head and moved past. He didn't need to buy anything. His mom had already packed him lunch. At the end of the line, he set his tray down and opened his old lunchbox. Inside was a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple with a bruise on one side, and a small thermos of soup. It wasn't flashy, but it was food, and it reminded him of home. He spotted an empty seat at the end of a long table and slid into it, hoping to disappear. But invisibility never lasted long here. A voice carried across the table. "Guess scholarships don't cover lunch." It was the tall boy from earlier, his hair perfect, his uniform pressed as if it had just come from the dry cleaners. His friends chuckled, leaning in. Daniel kept his eyes on his sandwich. He unwrapped it carefully, trying to ignore the heat crawling up his neck. Another boy smirked. Maybe he's going for extra credit, living like it's the 1950s. The laughter grew louder. Daniel took a bite anyway. The bread was soft, the peanut butter salty, the same as always. But under the weight of their stares, it felt like chewing gravel. From a few tables away, a different kind of gaze lingered. A girl with dark hair tied neatly back glanced at him. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't even whispering. She just watched quietly, curiosity flickering across her face. For half a second their eyes met before she turned away, but the moment stayed with him. The tall boy leaned forward, lowering his voice but making sure it carried. "Face it, man. Wrong shoes, wrong lunch, wrong everything. You won't last here." Daniel's hand tightened around his thermos. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Eat this, it will keep you strong." He thought about his dad's grease-stained hands at the garage, about the sacrifices they made so he could be here. He swallowed hard and lifted another spoonful of soup. If strength was measured by what you endured without breaking, then this silence, this patience was his strength. When the bell rang and the cafeteria emptied, Daniel packed his lunchbox with deliberate calm. The tall boy gave him one last smirk, but Daniel walked out steady, his chin a little higher than when he had walked in. And though no one else noticed, something small had changed. He wasn't just carrying a sandwich and a thermos anymore. He was carrying proof. Proof that he could hold his ground in a place that wanted him to fall. The first week at St. Andrews felt like stepping into a world that was already running without him. By the time he walked into his home room, everyone else seemed to know exactly where to sit, who to laugh with, and what role they played in this small kingdom of privilege. The room smelled faintly of new textbooks and polished floors. Posters of famous scientists lined the walls, smiling down as if they belonged here too. The boy with the worn backpack slipped quietly into a seat at the very back. The teacher, a tall man with greying hair and sharp glasses, barely glanced at him. "Class, we have a new student joining us through the scholarship program," he announced in a tone that was more fact than welcome. He motioned loosely toward the back row. "Introduce yourself." The boy stood slowly, every eye turned, and the silence felt louder than any laughter. "My name's Daniel," he said softly, his voice steady even though his heart pounded. A few kids muttered under their breath. The tall boy from the cafeteria smirked, nudging his friend. Someone whispered "scholarship kid" as if his name didn't matter at all. Daniel sat down, his cheeks hot, wishing the floor could swallow him whole. The lesson began. Numbers and formulas filled the board, the teacher's voice steady and precise. Students scribbled in expensive notebooks, tapping on tablets. Daniel opened his own battered spiral notebook, its cover bent at the edges. He wrote carefully, determined not to miss a single word. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the girl again, the one who had watched him in the cafeteria. She sat near the middle row, her dark hair tied neatly, her notes written in perfect handwriting. At one point, she glanced back. Their eyes met for a second before she looked down quickly. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. And in a room where every stare felt cold, that small flicker of neutrality was enough to keep him from sinking. The teacher asked a question. Hands shot up, quick and confident. Daniel hesitated, knowing the answer, but unsure if he wanted more attention on himself. He kept his hand down. The teacher scanned the room, ignoring the back row entirely. "Anyone else?" he asked, choosing a student in the front. Daniel watched as the answer was given, half right, half wrong. He clenched his pencil, biting his tongue. He knew he could have explained it better. He knew he could have shown them he belonged. But fear, heavy and unspoken, pressed him down. As the class moved on, the tall boy leaned back in his chair and whispered just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Keep that scholarship warm for me. Won't last long." Daniel stared at his notebook, forcing himself not to react. He copied down the next line of notes, his handwriting steady, his jaw tight. The bell rang, and chairs scraped against the floor. Students gathered their things in a rush of chatter and laughter. Daniel waited until the room emptied before slipping out, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. No one saw the quiet storm building inside him. No one saw the way every insult was stored, not as anger, but as fuel. One day, he promised himself, they wouldn't just know his name, they would remember it. By the middle of the week, Daniel had learned to blend into the background. He slipped into classrooms quietly, kept his eyes on his notes, and left just as fast when the bell rang. Staying invisible seemed easier than giving anyone another reason to laugh. But invisibility doesn't last forever. It was Thursday, right before lunch, when his math teacher closed the textbook with a sharp snap. The sound echoed through the room, pulling every wandering gaze back to the front. The teacher turned to the chalkboard and, with slow, deliberate strokes, wrote out a long equation. Symbols stretched across the black surface like a puzzle no one wanted to touch. "Let's try something different today," he said, dusting his hands. "This is a problem most of you won't see until college. Anyone who can solve it will earn more than just my respect." The room fell silent. Students leaned back in their chairs, exchanging uncertain glances. Even the confident ones, the kids who usually raced to answer before the question was finished, kept their hands down. Daniel's pencil stopped mid-scribble. He recognised the problem. Not the exact numbers, but the type. He'd seen something like it once, late at night, flipping through the old math book his dad had picked up at a thrift store. Back then, he'd traced the equations over and over until his eyes blurred, trying to understand why each step mattered. The teacher tapped the chalk against the board. "No volunteers?" His voice carried a mix of challenge and disappointment. A few kids chuckled nervously. The tall boy from the cafeteria leaned back with a smirk. "Looks like even the geniuses in the front row are stumped," he whispered loud enough for others to hear. Daniel's heart pounded. He could almost see the steps forming in his mind, each number falling into place. But speaking up meant inviting attention, again. And attention here usually came with laughter. He glanced around. Rows of students avoided the board, eyes glued to their desks. No one moved. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. His hand twitched against his notebook. He could stay quiet. He could let the moment pass like he always did. But something inside him pushed back, the same quiet storm that had been building since the first whisper, the first laugh, the first label stamped on him. The teacher sighed, beginning to lower the chalk. And then, before he could stop himself, Daniel heard his own voice break through the silence. "I'd like to try." The words weren't loud, but in the quiet room, they landed like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned. A few students snorted. One voice from the middle row said exactly what everyone was thinking. "The scholarship kid? No way." The tall boy grinned, shaking his head. "This should be good." Daniel's face burned, but he didn't look away. His eyes were fixed on the board, on the problem that felt less like numbers and more like a door only he had the key to. The teacher raised his eyebrows, surprised. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said, voice calm but curious. Daniel rose from his seat. His legs felt heavy, his palms damp, but there was no turning back now. He picked up his notebook, walked to the front and reached for the piece of chalk. Behind him, the whispers started again, sharp and cutting, but he forced them out of his mind. All that mattered was the problem on the board, and the chance to prove that he wasn't just the kid with the worn backpack. He was more than that, and before long everyone in this room was going to see it. The piece of chalk felt heavier than it should have, as if the whole room had poured its doubts into it. Daniel stood at the front of the class, his shoulders tense, the blackboard towering in front of him like a wall he had to climb. From the back, a laugh slipped out, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Then another followed. Soon, whispers grew into chuckles that spread like ripples in a pond. "The scholarship kid thinks he can do it," someone muttered, and the line was enough to ignite a wave of snickers. Daniel's hand hovered over the board. His face flushed hot, but he didn't turn around. He knew what he'd see if he did, the smirks, the rolling eyes, the ones already waiting for him to fail. The tall boy leaned forward in his chair, resting his chin on his hand with a grin. "Careful, man," he said, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Don't embarrass yourself too bad," his friends chuckled. Daniel swallowed, gripping the chalk tighter. He told himself to breathe, to focus. Behind him, the teacher cleared his throat. "Let's give him a chance." The tone was firm, but even the teacher sounded more curious than confident. Daniel lifted the chalk and made the first mark. The sound of it scratching against the board seemed to echo in the room. He wrote slowly, carefully, the first step of the equation taking shape. A boy in the middle row snorted. "He's guessing," he whispered. Laughter again. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept writing. Step by step, his hand moved, not rushing, not hesitating. He remembered the late nights hunched over that old math book, his dad's tired voice reminding him, "Don't quit just because it's hard. That's when it matters most." But every second at the board felt like standing in a storm. He could hear the low hum of voices, the sarcastic coughs, the sighs of disbelief. The weight of the room pressed against his back, daring him to crumble. For a moment, doubt almost won. He saw himself through their eyes, a boy in worn shoes with a second-hand backpack, pretending he belonged in a world that wasn't built for him. And then, as if on instinct, his mind snapped back to the numbers. The rhythm of solving, the logic flowing, the way the pieces fit together. He wasn't pretending. He knew this. He had studied it until the pages of his book nearly fell apart. He pressed the chalk harder, his letters and numbers growing clearer, more confident. The laughter behind him began to taper, confusion slipping in where mockery had been. One of the smart kids frowned, leaning forward to see better. Daniel didn't notice. His world had shrunk to the board, to the puzzle that was no longer impossible. And though the class still thought they were watching a mistake unfold, something was shifting, quietly, in the lines of chalk. By the time he stepped back for a breath, no one was laughing anymore. The board filled slowly, each mark of chalk carving out Daniel's determination. His handwriting wasn't as neat as the others, the strokes uneven, but the logic behind them was steady, unshakable. At first, the class was restless. Chairs squeaked, pencils tapped, whispers fluttered from desk to desk. But then something happened. One of the students in the front row squinted at the board, his pen frozen mid-note. "Wait," he whispered to the kid next to him. "That's actually right." The words weren't meant for Daniel, but the ripple spread. A few heads tilted. The sarcasm in the room softened into curiosity. The way a crowd quiets when it senses a fight isn't going the way they expected. Daniel didn't hear them. He was lost in the rhythm he knew so well. Step, check, step, check. It was like slipping into a language only he understood, one he had practiced alone at his kitchen table, under a dim light, while the world outside went on without him. Behind him, the tall boy smirked, less confidently now. His grin faltered as he leaned toward his friends. "He's just lucky," he muttered, but even he sounded unsure. The teacher, who had been standing with arms folded, slowly moved closer. His sharp eyes scanned the numbers on the board, following each line, each justification. The closer he looked, the more his expression changed, from polite skepticism to genuine surprise. Daniel paused, wiping his palm against his pants. His nerves still buzzed, but his mind was clear. The next step came naturally, flowing from one number to the next. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Behind him, the silence deepened. Students who had been half distracted a minute ago were leaning forward now, their laughter gone, replaced with a different sound entirely. Nothing. Just quiet, thick and heavy, as they tried to keep up with what was happening in front of them. One of the honour students, the kind who usually answered every question first, finally muttered, "He's not guessing, he knows what he's doing." Daniel didn't turn around. He didn't need their approval, not right now. All he needed was the board, the chalk, and the chance to finish what he had started. The last time he had felt this sure of himself was at home, alone in the silence of his family's living room, scribbling answers in a notebook with pages that had begun to fall apart. Back then, no one was watching, no one was doubting, and in a strange way, this didn't feel all that different. The board was just a bigger notebook, and the silence, though crowded, was still silence. He stepped back, exhaled slowly, and studied the first sequence of lines he had written. Solid, correct, undeniable. For the first time since he'd walked through the doors of St. Andrew's, he felt the balance of the room tilt. Not against him, but toward him. And though he didn't show it, a quiet thought pulsed beneath his calm. They thought I didn't belong here, but this is only the beginning. The chalk squeaked faintly as Daniel wrote the final steps. Each number linked seamlessly to the next, the pattern unfolding like a story only he knew how to tell. He paused once, checking his work, then pressed on, his strokes growing steadier with every line. Behind him, the classroom had gone so quiet that even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. No one whispered now, no one laughed. Chairs that had once leaned back lazily were upright, their owners leaning forward, eyes locked on the board. Daniel felt it, the shift in the room. The doubt that had weighed down every step he took in this place was loosening, piece by piece, with every answer he laid out in chalk. His hand slowed as he reached the final line. For a second, his pulse quickened. He could almost hear his dad's voice in his head, the words from nights spent hunched over that battered math book. "Don't quit when it gets hard, son. Finish it. Always finish it." He pressed the chalk down one last time. A number, a symbol, then a single underline. The answer glowed pale white against the black surface, simple and absolute, correct. He let the chalk fall from his fingers, the sound of it clinking softly on the tray beneath the board. Then he stepped back, his breath uneven, his palms damp. For a moment, the silence stretched so long he thought maybe he had miscalculated. Maybe they were all just waiting for him to realise he'd been wrong all along. Then the teacher moved. Slowly, the man walked forward, his shoes echoing against the polished floor. He scanned the board, his eyes tracing each step. His brow furrowed at first, then lifted. His hand hovered near the numbers, following the trail Daniel had left behind. When he finally turned back to the class, his voice was calm, but carried a weight that hushed even the shallowest breath. "Perfect," he said. The word landed like a hammer. Gasps broke the silence. A few students blinked hard, as if they needed to see the board again to believe it. The tall boy who had mocked Daniel leaned back in his chair, his grin gone, replaced with something closer to disbelief. Daniel stood still, his chest rising and falling, not daring to smile. He wasn't used to moments like this, moments where he wasn't the target of laughter but the centre of stunned silence. The teacher's eyes settled on him again, sharper now, but not with doubt, with respect. And in that instant, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since the day he'd opened the letter that said, "Congratulations, you've been awarded a full scholarship. Belonging." He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The proof was written across the board for everyone to see. For a long moment, no one moved. The final word from the teacher still hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Perfect. Daniel stood frozen, his back still half turned toward the board. His fingers twitched as if they didn't know what to do now that they weren't holding the chalk. The silence pressed in, thicker than the laughter had ever been. Then from somewhere near the middle rows, a single sound broke through. Clap! It was hesitant at first, one pair of hands coming together, almost uncertain. All heads turned toward the sound. A boy sitting near the front, usually quiet, was on his feet. He clapped again, louder this time, his face lit with something between shock and admiration. And then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the silence shattered. Hands slammed together, echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the room. Students who had laughed earlier were now on their feet, clapping so hard their palms turned red. The noise grew until it was impossible to ignore, a wave of applause crashing over the disbelief that had ruled only minutes ago. Daniel blinked, stunned. He had prepared himself for laughter, for mockery, for whispers that would haunt him the rest of the semester. He had not prepared for this, the sound of respect, loud and undeniable. The tall boy who had taunted him so often sat stiffly in his chair, his face tight, his hands motionless on the desk. For once he had nothing to say, and in the middle of the storm of applause, Daniel caught sight of her, the girl with dark hair who had watched him before. She wasn't clapping wildly like the others. Instead, she smiled, small but steady, and for the first time since he arrived, it felt like someone truly saw him. The teacher raised his hand, quieting the room. His expression was unreadable for a second, then softened. "Sit down," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Let's continue." The clapping faded, but the energy lingered. Daniel returned to his seat slowly, his legs trembling as if he had just run a race. The notebook on his desk felt different now, less like a shield and more like proof of what he could do. As he sat down, a boy across the aisle leaned toward him, eyes wide. "How did you even do that?" he whispered, more awe than mockery. Daniel didn't answer. He only opened his notebook and wrote the date at the top of the page, steadying his breath. Inside, though, something had shifted forever. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the scholarship kid. For the first time since walking through those gates, he felt like a student of St. Andrew's Academy, and the applause still echoing faintly in his ears told him one truth he would never forget. Sometimes respect isn't given. Sometimes you have to earn it, one line at a time. The clapping had faded, but the energy still buzzed in the room when the teacher turned back toward Daniel. His gaze was steady now, the sharpness replaced with something closer to curiosity. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying across the rows of desks, "where did you learn to solve problems like this?" Dozens of heads swiveled toward Daniel. For the first time since arriving at St. Andrews, the silence wasn't hostile, it was waiting. Daniel's throat tightened. Part of him wanted to shrug, to downplay it, to avoid saying anything that might sound like weakness. But another part of him, the part that had carried him through every late night, knew the truth mattered. "At home," he said quietly. "My dad found an old math book at a thrift store a couple of years ago. Half the pages were missing, but I read it every night, tried the problems over and over until I could get them right." The room stilled even more, as if the walls themselves were listening. "We couldn't afford tutors," Daniel went on, his fingers tightening around the edge of his notebook. "Most nights my parents worked late, so I just kept practicing, sometimes until the lamp burned out." The weight of his words lingered in the air. In the front row, one of the honour students, the kind who usually breezed through every test, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at Daniel with something that wasn't pity, but shame, as if realising how much he had taken for granted. Even the tall boy sat rigid, his earlier smirk erased. He drummed his fingers against the desk once, then stopped, his jaw tight. For once he had no comeback. Daniel lowered his eyes, wishing he hadn't said so much. But then, from across the room, he noticed her, the girl with dark hair. She gave him a small, deliberate nod. Not pity, not awe, just recognition. As if she understood that what he had done wasn't luck, but work. Quiet, invisible work that no one else had seen. The teacher's voice broke the silence. "Discipline," he said, almost to himself. "That's what it takes." Then louder to the class, "Let that be a lesson, B." The bell rang, sudden and jarring. Students scrambled for their bags, but the usual rush of chatter was missing. Instead, they filed out quietly, glancing at Daniel as they passed. Some looked away quickly, guilt in their eyes. Others lingered for a second longer, respect flickering where mockery used to be. One boy paused near his desk, hesitating. "You did all that from one book?" he asked softly. Daniel closed his notebook and slipped it into his bag. "One book," he said, "and a lot of nights." The boy nodded, then hurried to catch up with his friends. Daniel stood slowly, the strap of his worn backpack pressing into his shoulder. For the first time all week, the silence that followed him out of the room didn't feel heavy. It felt like space clearing in front of him, making room for something new: respect. The story spread through St. Andrews faster than gossip usually did. By the end of the day, kids from other classes were whispering about the scholarship boy who had solved the unsolvable problem. Some doubted it at first, thinking it was just another rumour. But anyone who had been in that math classroom knew the truth. They had seen it with their own eyes, written clear across the board in chalk. Daniel didn't walk any differently through the hallways, but people noticed him now. A few nodded when he passed, subtle but genuine. Others just stared, not sure what to say. The tall boy, the one who had mocked him so loudly, kept his distance. His silence said more than his insults ever had. The cafeteria felt different too. The next day at lunch, Daniel sat down at the same end of the table, opening his old lunchbox with the same peanut butter sandwich and apple inside. For a moment, he braced himself for the usual comments, but none came. Instead, one of the boys who had laughed the loudest the day before slid onto the bench across from him. "Hey," the boy said awkwardly, unwrapping his own sandwich. "Mind if I sit here?" Daniel blinked, surprised, but nodded. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start. From a few tables away, the girl with dark hair watched, then gave him that same small, steady smile. He felt something loosen in his chest, something lighter than he'd carried all week. When the final bell rang, Daniel walked out of the building and down the familiar sidewalk toward home. The air was crisp, the sky painted with streaks of late afternoon orange. His backpack dug into his shoulders, heavy as always, but he didn't mind. At the corner, his father's old truck was parked by the curb, dented and rusting, but reliable in the way that mattered most. His dad leaned out the window, his face tired but warm. "So," he called, "how was your first week?" Daniel opened the passenger door and climbed in, dropping his bag between his feet. For a second, he thought about telling him everything, the whispers, the laughter, the moment at the board when the whole room finally saw him. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just smiled faintly, looking out the window as the truck rumbled forward. "Better than I thought," he said softly. His dad glanced at him, eyebrows raised, then nodded once. That was enough. As the school faded in the distance, Daniel rested his head against the seat. The echoes of applause still lingered in his ears, not as noise, but as something deeper, recognition. And in that moment, he understood that he didn't need to change who he was to belong here. He just needed to keep proving, day after day, what he already knew. That brilliance doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't come with a last name or a car parked out front. Sometimes, brilliance walks in with worn shoes, carrying nothing but a battered backpack, and still changes everything. In the end, Daniel's story reminds us of something simple but powerful. It's not the clothes you wear, the lunch you bring, or the car you arrive in that defines your worth. It's the discipline, the patience, and the quiet work no one sees that shape who you are. And maybe the real question for us is this: what are you building in silence today that one day will speak louder than words? Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Take care of yourself, and may your days be filled with quiet strength and clarity. I'll see you again soon, right here on Rain Inside.